Today we are talking about the application of an equity lens to the development of technology for older adults. We have Dr. Karen Kobayashi and Dr. Simon Carroll joining us today, and I'll introduce them in a moment. If you could go to the next slide. So this is part of an AgeWell webinar series. As some of you know, AgeWell is a network of centers of excellence. It's Canada's technology and aging network, federally funded by the government. We have over 150 researchers and close to 400 trainees in our network, working with over 220 partners from community, non-for-profits, industry, and government. Go ahead with the next slide. So our vision is to harness the potential of technology to provide high quality and sustainable services and solutions to meet the needs of current and future generations of older adults in Canada. If you're not familiar with our amazing acronym, it stands for Aging Gracefully Across Environments, Using Technology to Support Wellness, Engagement, and Long Life. And the goal really is to create capacity for Canada to further establish its position as a global leader in the technology and aging space. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So today we have two amazing presenters. First, we have Dr. Karen Kobayashi, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Research and a research affiliate with the Center on Aging. She is a social gerontologist who uses a life course perspective to explore the intersections of structural, cultural, and individual factors, experiences affecting health and aging in Canada. Karen is also one of the leads of the knowledge mobilization cross-cutting activity as part of the AgeWell network. Joining us today, we also have Dr. Simon Carroll. Simon is an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Victoria as well. He teaches a variety of courses at the undergraduate level and has a particular interest in the sociology of health and illness and in social justice and inequalities. Simon's research focuses on sociological approaches to understanding health systems, specifically from a health promotion perspective. So welcome to our speakers and our attendees. And Karen, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Dorena, for the introduction. So welcome, everyone. Just to be, we're going to be sort of brief in the initial slides, and we'll spend a little bit more time on the practical end for further on in the presentation. So in this presentation, we're going to consider the following questions in rethinking assistive technology development. First of all, what difference does it make to apply an equity lens to the development of assistive technologies for older adults? Secondly, how do the social determinants of health impact on the implementation and the use of assistive technologies for older adults? Third, what are the intersectional experiences that actually serve to impact the capacity of older adults to engage with assistive technologies? And finally, and probably what many of you are here for, is we're going to talk about, give you some practical advice on how an equity lens can actually help teams to successfully develop efficient and effective technologies. So first of all, I'm going to be speaking about more on the conceptual sides of setting the stage for Simon to talk about the more practical pieces. So we're going to talk a little bit about what health equity is. Health equity certainly is a construct or a term that means, well, that is concerned with creating equal opportunities for good health. So it's created when individuals have the opportunity, we know, to achieve their full health potential, both mentally and physically. And health equity is undermined when preventable and avoidable systematic conditions constrain the choices that we are able to make over our life courses. And this is taken from the Canadian Medical Association. But certainly we know with regards to health equity that evidence has indicated that people who belong to certain population groups tend to experience disparities in health status access to services, and the quality of care that they receive. So the factors such as gender, race or ethnicity, sexual orientation, immigration status, income, education can all influence an individual's access or ability to access timely and appropriate and quality care. So again, when we go back to thinking about what health equity is concerned with, remember it is about creating equal opportunities for good health for all and reducing avoidable and unjust, what we would call unjust differences in health among certain population groups. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the social determinants of health. And the definition that we usually use, or we normally use, and the one that is used, of course, by Dennis Raphael in his book around the social determinants of health, a series of texts on the social determinants of health, is one that's been put forward by the World Health Organization. And they define the social determinants of health as the circumstances in which people are born, in which they develop and they live and age. And these include, and I've mentioned some of these when I talked about health equity, these include factors such as income and income distribution, early life course experiences, education, food security and housing, employment and the conditions in which we work, unemployment and job security. And here we can link to issues of the increase in what we've seen as precarious employment or part-time or employment that has no benefits, et cetera. The social safety net that exists in a particular context, a national provincial context, social inclusion and exclusion, and health services. So I want you to think about this in the context of health equity. And we've mentioned that health equity, of course, is concerned with the provision of good or high quality healthcare for all individuals, regardless of their standing in terms of income or housing or, the food security, et cetera, or employment. So the social determinants of adult health, we're going to speak about this particularly in the context of older adults. The focus, of course, or the population group that AgeWell is most interested in. So older adults, we know, are affected by many of the same determinants that we had mentioned as our younger people. But these determinants can have specific impacts on older adults. And when we speak about the specific impacts, what we mean here is that the accumulation of disadvantage over time, in other words, the cumulative effect of disadvantage that's experienced over the course of one's life can certainly begin to manifest itself manifest in later life. Certain social determinants certainly have very important implications for both physical and mental health outcomes. And these are things like housing, employment, we know, gender. And when we talk about housing and employment and education, we're referring to these, of course, in the context of an index of socioeconomic status. But we're also really concerned with things like social support networks, which speaks to the issue of social inclusion as well, how included one would feel. Loneliness is also a really interesting and important and emerging determinant that we look at. And the accumulation of isolation and loneliness, or the cumulative effect of social isolation and loneliness over time, can lead to significant cognitive or mental health, negative mental health outcomes, as well as physical health outcomes. And I know Simon will pick up a little bit on this in a moment. The theoretical framework that we use when we think about health equity is intersectionality. And intersectionality is a theoretical or conceptual framework that considers simultaneous interactions or concomitant interactions between different aspects of identity, of social identity. So race and ethnicity, indigeneity, gender, class, sexuality, geography, or place of residence where one lives, Age is another important aspect of social identity. Ability, immigration status, religion. These are some of the main ones that we see in the literature that have been examined in the literature. So intersectionality also, as a framework, considers the impact of systems and processes of oppression and domination. This is Alina Henkivsky's work and her book that was written about a decade ago in this particular area, which focused on racism, classism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, and the impact that these particular processes of oppression have had on health outcomes. So I'm going to pass it off. I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Simon, to talk a little bit more about, or give you some examples of what we've been speaking about with regards to health equity, intersectionality, and social determinants of health.
Great, thanks, Karen. So what I'm going to do first is just use a particular example that sort of transitions us towards the more applied or practical aspect of the webinar. And that's, okay, we've heard about health equity, the social determinants of health, intersectionality, which are all very sort of well established sociological and health research concepts and terms. But how are we kind of going to make them fit or make them understandable from the context of a person trying to do research on assisted living technologies or assistive technologies for older adults? And so one of the sort of mediating ideas between those larger concepts and the more direct practical issue of how do older adults actually effectively use assistive technologies is the concept of health literacy. And the reason, before I go into the how do we define health literacy, the reason that is, of course, is that health literacy is a kind of a capacity, a set of cognitive capacities and skills that older adults require in order to effectively interact with health services in general, but certainly specifically in relation to assistive technologies. So health literacy, as we can see on the screen, is a possession of literacy skills that are required to make health-related decisions in a variety of different environments. So rather than literacy alone, we're talking about a specific type of literacy, a literacy that's related directly to health. So it describes the cognitive and social skills which determine the motivation and ability of individuals to gain access to, understand, and use information in ways that promote and maintain health. So before we move on to the last bullet point there, I want you to just really pay attention to that, to one particular word there that might jump out at you as sort of surprising, and that's motivation. And I think it's really important to note the link between people's self-efficacy, their capacity to, their ability to successfully work and interact with technology, and their motivation to do so. And I'll talk a little bit later about a lot of the research we see in terms of successful implementation and use of assistive technologies is a lack of motivation of end users to actually use them, even after they've been installed in their homes, et cetera, et cetera. So health literacy also represents an observable set of cognitive and social skills that vary from individual to individual. And that variance from individual to individual is determined largely by the same social determinants that we're interested in. So the research in health literacy is very clear. The summary of the research can pretty much say that if you want to measure people's health literacy, you find that you have the same step-by-step sliding scale of capacity based on your level of social status, income, and the basic social determinants that we're interested in. In other words, at the lower end of all of those things that where most disadvantage is found across all the different types of determinants, you see the lowest health literacy scores. And then of course, the converse applies. The higher you go, the higher the health literacy scores. So that's just an example of how you start to transition from those more sort of higher level sociological concepts to some pretty practical issues in relation to assistive technologies. Now, in terms of applying the equity lens, I just want to start with an overview. We'll come back to some of these when we talk about our practical sort of advice or recommendations to research groups or researchers trying to do this type of research. First of all, some of the things we might start to think about is, who is your target population? Are you developing a technology or a product that is relevant to the general population of older adults? Is it some specific geographical location? Is it some specific set or subset of the older adult population who have some particular cognitive or functional needs? So who are you working with? Who are you aiming to? And this can, of course, apply whether it's a commercialization of a product or whether it's some sort of knowledge product. So are there specific demographic characteristics of the end users that should be taken into account? What do we mean by demographic? Well, it's another sort of social science term, but really it just refers to what of those types of different potential social categories that we talked about when we talked about social determinants of health. In other words, what is your gender? What is your ethnicity? What is your income status? All those things are demographic characteristics. So what we might want to know as a research team is, what do we know about our target population? What do we know about the types of potential demographic issues that they might be dealing with? Second, does assistive technology have specific functional requirements that may be more difficult to meet for certain population groups? So let's go back to the issue of health literacy just to sort of connect this in a more practical way. Is it true that the particular technology you have, whether it's a knowledge product or some sort of monitoring device, does it require a certain level of health literacy to effectively engage with it? And are the people you're trying to work with potentially have more disadvantage in relation to those functional requirements?
Hey, sorry to interrupt, Simon. A couple of people are having trouble hearing you, so if you could just speak up just a little bit, that would be great.
That's no problem. Can you hear me better right now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I can also, if you need me to slow down, just give me a little sort of.
I think you're good. Thank you.
So a really important point as well is, are you engaging older adults as end users in the research process? I think the recommendation from CC1, from the Knowledge Mobilization Group, is pretty universally, you should be trying to. We can all understand practical challenges and barriers that certain research teams have in relation to resources, et cetera, in order to do that. But to the extent that you are the people that you're engaging demographically representative of the target population? Now, here we don't mean representative in the statistical sense. What we really mean is, if you look at who you're trying to actually end up implementing the product with, are the people who are engaging as older adults in your research process, are they diverse enough to sort of cover some of the major diverse groups in your target population? And then finally, what specific challenges do certain groups of older adults have that might prevent them from engaging in the research process? So this is connected to the previous point. A lot of the times, there's a lot of great intentions, I think, by researchers these days. People are becoming more and more aware, particularly in technology development, of the need to actively engage end users in the process. A lot of people talking about participatory design, co-design, et cetera. But the intentions are not always good enough, as many of you may have already discovered. And so we have to start to think about, based on the types of issues or disadvantages that certain groups meet, how might we sort of address those problems and more actively engage certain groups that may actually have a harder time being involved. And remember, the reason to do this is that in the end, you're going to be trying to implement these technologies with those groups. So if all you learn about are the most advantaged group of older adults, you're going to miss out on what those real challenges are when they try to implement the technology in the real world. So this is a slide now where we're shifting to start to think about the concept of intersectionality and how this starts to have an impact on really how people live their everyday lives and what difference it makes with assistive technologies. So how is the lived experiential context of end users, how can it shape their ability and willingness to adopt and adapt new assistive technologies into their lives? And that's really the key idea here, is that people aren't living in laboratories. They live in real places and real families and real neighborhoods. And we have to learn something about what those contexts are like in order to understand whether or not assistive technologies are going to be successfully implemented. And of course, those lived experiential contexts are shaped in various ways by the various social determinants we've been talking about. And over the life course, and I think this is kind of really important, that sort of overlaps with a lot of the type of work that Karen and I both do, Karen with various groups of older adults from different backgrounds, myself from health promotion, is that really the fact is that all of these different things that work together, where you live, your gender, your ethnic background, your income over time, all those things end up in a complex way, making a real lived experiential context of an older adult. It all comes together at a certain point, and that's the point where you're starting to engage with these people. And we have to sort of be cognizant as much as possible about how their life courses have brought them to the place they are. And really, again, it's that idea that certain groups in the population are going to be more impacted by some of those life course experiences than others. So how do we move from social determinants to these, what I'm calling lived experiential contexts? Well, factors such as gender, income, race, ethnicity, etc., interact to produce environments that do not or might not support the successful uptake and use of new assistive technologies. We can see this in a variety of ways, which I'll move on to when we talk about some examples in a few minutes. But I imagine that many of you are starting to think about already how some of this might make a difference and how it might be more difficult to use particular types of assistive technologies or learn about them. So for example, certain intersectional disadvantages can cause disproportionate levels of multiple morbidity in population groups who experience a lack of adequate income combined with racial and gender discrimination, those intersectoral oppressive structures we talked about. And I think this is a kind of, there's two really general findings in the medical and health research that I want to reference here. One is that we know that multiple morbidity is differentially distributed across the same social gradient that we were talking about in terms of social determinants of health. In other words, we know that multiple morbidity, people with many different health issues is a problem for many people in the population, but it's more of a problem for people at the bottom end of the ladder. Why is that important? Well, one of the things we know about health research is a lot of research in the effectiveness of pharmaceutical use around this, and that's that we do a lot of our research in the laboratory around efficacy, in other words, the causal effectiveness of the causal link between an intervention and an outcome. And that often excludes multiple morbidity. In other words, we purposely select people that have less problems in order to get a better efficacy study, a better sort of lab study, you might say, in terms of assistive technologies. But the problem is out there in the real world, people are actually dealing with multiple morbidities. And quite often with assistive technologies focused on one specific functional issue, they fail because they're being implemented in a context where people are dealing with many interacting morbidities that can actually make the use of the assistive technology highly problematic. So that's kind of the last bullet point there. And what I want to do now is to shift to talk a little bit about some particular examples. So one of the fascinating things about doing research on some of the persistent failures in terms of implementation of assistive technologies, and without sort of being pessimistic, what we can say is one of the clear findings of the research is that implementation failure is kind of quite ubiquitous. In other words, it's quite widespread. And one of the areas, emerging areas of research is around ethnographic studies of, well, what does it look like when someone's actually trying to use these assistive technologies, and what are the actual barriers people are running into? So what we often find is that patients and clients find it difficult to conform to the requirements of new technologies because of life circumstances. And those life circumstances, of course, as we've already talked about, are shaped and inflected by these health equity issues. One great example is the telehealth routine to monitor blood glucose levels. There was this patient who was called Angela in the study. And Angela was trying to set up a routine where she would send in her information, and she was meant to send in her information on Mondays, but Angela also happened to be a primary caregiver to her schizophrenic husband, who she could hardly ever leave. And when she could leave, when he was in a good state of mind, that's when she went and tried to do all her household chores and went shopping and so on. And guess what? Sometimes that happened on Mondays and she wasn't able to keep with her routine, etc. Now the lesson here, I think, is the types of life contingencies that we all have can impact the use of assistive technologies, no matter how advantaged you are. But the difficulty of coping, the amount of different issues that you struggle with tend to be much larger for people dealing with these intersectional and social determinant disadvantages. So we know that these so-called everyday life contingencies are ubiquitous, are widespread in relation to the implementation and use of assistive technologies. One of the things that I think is really important to consider are three sort of areas that we can see in the ethnographic literature emerging around what contexts end users are telling us would be more helpful to them dealing with their lived experiential context. So one of them is the idea of configurability. One of the ideas is how adaptable is the assistive technology? How easily can it be integrated into the particular contingencies of an individual's life? The fact that they already have perhaps several other assistive technologies already implemented in their home. The fact that they have, they're the primary caregiver for someone, that means they can't do things in exactly the standard way, et cetera, et cetera. So to what extent can researchers developing and designing assistive technologies take into account or allow for user adaptability? I think that's one major issue. The other one, I think, is what we quite often find is that we think of the implementation of assistive technologies as some sort of event. Like someone gets contracted out to go and put the assistive technology in the home or whatever, and then they go away and maybe there's a follow-up 6 months later to see whether or not the person used it or it worked, et cetera, et cetera. Or if there's some crisis event or whatever, someone goes in and helps them. And what the research is showing is that probably it's more important to have some sort of consistent support and communication from people that can help the end user adapt the technology to their everyday life. So that's a second one. And then the third one, which I think is really important to think about in terms of, again, an equity perspective, an equity lens. And that's the communication between various different aspects of the health system. One thing we know about the development and use of assistive technologies, and of course AgeWell in particular, is its purpose in some way is to engage the intersectorality of assistive technologies. In other words, the fact that you're dealing with governments, you're dealing with practitioners, you're dealing with private corporations, etc. And that's great. And it's great to bring all those people together in order to develop the technology. But we also have to take into account the context of the technology's use. And what we find really is, particularly with disadvantaged groups, is that there's a lot of disjointed services and a lot of duplicate things going on. There's a lot of contradictions between timing in terms of when one service happens, when another does. So communication between the different parts of the system is also a key part of helping the technologies be adapted and implemented. Specifically, one of the things that actually came up quite often in the research was that quite often the designers of the technology or the commercializers of the technology subcontract out the implementation or the installation of the technology. And then there becomes established a communication gap between the designers, the people that can perhaps help to make adaptations or reconfigure the technology, and the actual people that went and put it into place. So there's all sorts of sort of issues there that we could look at. I want to end up just sort of coming full circle to that overview sort of slide of what we should look at, to some just very generic practical advice. First, simply identify and explore the challenges that you think may emerge in trying to use or engage with certain technologies, particularly in relation to specific populations who experience known disadvantages. So, of course, there is not some guarantee that you will have the perfect information. There's practical issues around how much it costs to find out that information, but quite often with little effort and some help from your interdisciplinary colleagues, you can establish some of these issues and demographic characteristics and have some information about potential disadvantage with the populations you're working with. Also, aim to make sure you recruit what we might call hard to reach older adults in your engagement processes. Paying particular attention, to barriers related to things like culture, gender norms, social class, etc. One of the things, I don't know if Karen can probably add in when we have some questions about this, but one thing we've noticed in a lot of research, not just in assistive technologies, but health-related research in general, health intervention research, is that engaging older adults from particular ethnic backgrounds with gender backgrounds, it makes it quite difficult for them to participate in many of the engagement processes that you might set up as a sort of standard way of engaging. So how is your research group taking into account the fact that there's these real barriers that people can have to engage in your process? And then finally, I think, something that's being pushed more and more in the research that we've been sort of cutting edge research, I think, around knowledge mobilization, is involve the older adult end users in the design process itself, if possible. So not just in commercializing the end product, not just in disseminating it, not just in messaging it, but in fact, the earlier you get the feedback, then you are able to incorporate into your design factors like the needs of a much more diverse older adult population, and being able to take account of some of those equity implications that we've talked about so far in the webinar. So I'm going to end there, and we can turn it back over to Dorina, I suppose, and she can moderate. Thank you.
Great, thank you both for a great presentation. I'm just going to let folks ask some questions. So again, feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat box. I will start us off with a question just for either of you or both of you. I'm just wondering, I'm always thinking about the policy side of things, and wondering, given all the challenges that you've laid out and things that folks need to take into consideration, how can we how can we build health equity into policy from a policy perspective? How can that be incorporated or considered?
Do you mean, sorry, can I clarify, Dorina? Do you mean
Yeah.
policy in terms of age-well policy, or do you mean policy in terms of public policy in general?
I mean more like assistive technology policies. I mean, we've seen coming out of the network, and I see Rosalie is was one of the attendees. We've just looked at just the differences across Canada in terms of assistive technology policy, and it's pretty piecemeal. So I always wonder about, you know, access and equity in that respect at a policy level.
Yeah.
This would be Simon's area because he's worked in government, so I'm going to let
Well, I think there's kind of two general things. One is policy that would cover the overall aspect of engagement and implementation, right? So we've kind of talked about that this seminar. There's another huge equity policy that we didn't really focus on in this particular seminar because it's kind of at a more abstract level, and that's simply the ability to pay, and whether or not the technologies are distributed mainly through commodified form, in other words, through the marketplace, or whether they're distributed on the basis of need via public provision. And of course, that has huge equity implications, because to the extent that things are provided by the marketplace, they automatically are available and accessible to people based on the ability to pay, or having access to very good private insurance, etc. So I think those are kind of, that's the two big areas, I think.
Yeah.
Specifically about what we've been talking about today, I think it's really kind of the idea that you should know about who it is that you're supposedly trying to help, and take into account how that makes it both difficult to use the technologies and difficult to engage in sort of helping to design the technology.
Right, and that becomes an important part of any discussion that you have with a policymaker or who's at the table as a stakeholder. So I'm glad you brought that up, Simon, around the ability to pay piece, because that's really an age-well, of course, is an NCE that is Tri-Council funded. So we feel we have a responsibility, certainly, to take into account the key issue is really the ability to pay is a key issue for our network.
Yeah, so we know, for example, that CIHR, one of the three funding councils, has in its basic sort of outline and goals to reduce health equity.
Yeah.
And so that implies that everything funded by CIHR should take that into account. So it's really, how do you translate that into specific technology development policy?
Right, yeah.
Great, thank you. We have one question from Olive online asking, does internet access impact on technology use, for example, the poor connectivity in rural areas?
Yeah, absolutely. And it impacts in a variety of ways. So it impacts just in terms of the on-off access. Do you or do you not have access to the internet? And quality, what level of quality. But here is where the health literacy piece comes in. What is your capacity as an end user to use the technology, whether or not you have the highest level of internet access technically, right? So I think access is always a diverse or multi-dimensional issue. It's both the fact that, yes, you might just not have access to broadband technology where you live, but even if you do, you might not have the health literacy in order to actually engage with that type of technology.
And to follow up on that, we're doing a project right now in the interior of the province, in the interior of British Columbia right now, in small villages in the Kootenay area. And they have very poor access, like when you're talking about access to broadband technology. And this speaks to, I'm working with a health geographer, of course, who's really interested in sort of the meaning of place and looks at differences between rural and remote communities and urban communities and their access to technology. What we're seeing is that telehealth programs, like actually picking up the telephone and trying to access resources, is used far more often because the internet connections are so spotty. So telephone connections are far more reliable still in some of these small communities. And so that's certainly an issue that that the health authorities in this province anyway are paying attention to. I hope hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you. I've got one more question myself. Oh, I see someone has posted another question, so I'll take that one first. So Leslie is asking, thinking with that intersectoral perspective, perhaps it's not only about ability to pay, as important as that is, might it also be about acceptability and appropriateness? So thinking about cultural, religious, social, psychological factors, I guess.
Yes.
So I guess kind of a question, comment.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with that.
Yeah. So class isn't the only marker of social inequality that we consider. And certainly the intersectionality framework is really about the fact that we use an intersectionality framework to understand this conceptually, but also practically is important here. And so cultural factors, in addition to as you mentioned, in addition to issues of class and how, housing, income and education, et cetera, are important, but also as they intersect, we make a concerted effort to underscore the importance of ethnocultural variations in preferences, and when we're talking about adaptability and implementation, one of the projects that we're working on right now here with South Asian and Chinese immigrants is around the use of not focusing on the individual, but focusing on the family with regards to decision making around technology uptake, because that's very central, very important to any kind of implementation in these communities. And it does vary, of course. We can't just say that ethnicity matters alone. It matters in intersection with immigration status and time since immigration. Longer term immigrants, depending on where they are on an acculturation continuum, may feel very confident in making decisions on their own. Whereas more, those who have come in under family sponsorship and are relatively recent immigrants may feel very, they're reliant on, obligated to their sponsors, who are most often times their children, their adult children. So I absolutely agree with that. And I know that also the uptake of technology in ethnocultural communities is also highly gendered. So that decision-making around even the consideration of whether or not a particular technology is appropriate is oftentimes made by men and not by women. So that's something as they age, among older adult populations. Yeah. So thank you for the comment, because we certainly, as researchers who use intersectionality frames of reference to construct our research projects or research studies, that's a very important comment.
It's really, just to add quickly, it's really just getting away from an either or kind of conceptualization. I think, if you think about what Karen just said, we actually can see how the economic and the cultural intersect and the immigration status intersect. So certain cultural groups, certain the early immigrants or people who have just arrived in Canada are often economically exploited more than others, end up having to work much longer hours per week, and then find it difficult to engage in assistive technology. So it's kind of a back and forth interactive relationship between all these different factors that need to be taken into account, I think.
Yeah, that's a really important point around the need for more of these ethnographic type research. that really follows people over time in their lived, in their lived context.
Yeah, because real people don't experience themselves as just from a particular culture or just from a particular socioeconomic class or just from a particular gender. All those things.
Yeah, and we know that those identities shift over time as well. Not only when we think about over time, but even over the course of a day, depending on how they are treated, whether or not they experience discrimination, et cetera. So these are all sort of important considerations.
Great, thank you both. We've got a couple of more questions that have come in, so I'm really enjoying the discussion. This one's from Rosalie. So she's wondering if you have any suggestions for processes, so either frameworks or systematic approaches that we can apply to guide product or service design, or even to evaluate our technology or policies that are in existence. And I think that's a really great question, because I had a similar one myself, specifically having seen folks use kind of the health equity impact assessment, which is a tool being used in Ontario that's been created by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care in this province. So I've seen kind of that being used as a tool, but wondering, I guess, if there's any other frameworks or systematic approaches from Rosalie.
Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of different ways people have tried to apply equity lenses to both at a sort of population level and also at a care services level. There's a group that has been using it in terms of public health services in British Columbia and Ontario, called the Equity Lens in Public Health program, which has just come to an end in the last year or so, and I was a part of that program. So that came up with actually an inventory of tools, which I would be happy to share through you, Dorina, and you could post it so that the people on the webinar would have access to it.
Great, for sure.
Yeah, that's one thing. The other thing is just in terms of sort of a process that has maybe more to do with general engagement, but certainly could also be, as long as you recruited sensitively. One of the things that's coming out in the literature is the idea of co-design workshops. So these are sort of, and some people in AgeWell are already doing some versions of these, I think. But this is where you actually bring in users together with the technologists and other members of the research team. You facilitate early process design workshops. And this is where you get feedback. And of course, if you have a diverse recruitment strategy for your end users in that process, then you can really learn a lot about some of these more lived experiential issues.
Great, thank you. So we'll share a couple of those resources. Got a question from Natalie. Could you share with us examples of technologies that have taken into account these considerations into their design and implementation? I don't know if you know of any.
Yeah. We can talk about it, or we can any of the health promotions.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few. I mean, one of the things one example I found interesting was alert technologies that people, for example, there's one example where you're meant to have a pendant that you carry around with you or you have. But what happens is that quite often older adults, particularly with cognitive decline, misplace their pendant quite frequently. And so the idea was that you'd put a button at the bedside that would actually help them. And that wasn't in the original technology, but it was something that would be an easy adaptation, right? So that type of thing is often sort of, but there's a real tension and struggle, I think, between technology development and adaptability, because of course, there's costs, there's difficulties in terms of competitive products. You know, people tend to be developing products to try to have some sort of exclusivity in terms of use and so on. So there's things to overcome, but I think there are quite a few examples of where an original technology realizes that some sort of simple adaptation can actually help with a large number of potential users. Right?
I think one of the, thanks Simon, yeah, I think in response to this question, just a general example would be in healthcare authorities right now in British Columbia, who are changing over to e-health initiatives, right? And using, for example, tablets on units now in long-term care. So what these tablets have now, with regards to recognizing or taking into account ethnocultural dimensions of their older adult population, is they have translating sort of software. They have, instead of, because we know that there is no budget usually set aside in residential care contexts for interpreters or translators other than family members. So that when family members aren't there, certainly it's challenging to try and communicate with those residents who don't have first language, who don't have English or French as their first language. So just sort of, very simply, translation and interpretation kind of software, functions, apps on iPads and things are helping, but we know really to truly understand the cultural sort of difference or variations perhaps, or the reasons or the rationale behind why Mrs. A doesn't want to take her bath at this time really require beyond, it goes beyond language. It goes beyond language to understanding life course history as it intersects with migration history and cultural context. So that's where, I know that families have been playing a larger role in developing e-health care plans for their loved ones.
Yeah, I think just in terms of those three aspects I talked about at the end of the talk, which were configurability, support, and communication, what you can think about there is that how is it that the technologies can be adapted or changed in relation to what the particular people are already dealing with. And of course, if there is some sort of ongoing support, some sort of consistent connection to and social connection to these technologies. One really interesting idea here is that often we think of assisted living technologies as creating autonomy and independence for older adults, when in fact what they actually need is more social connection and more social cohesion, right? So in some ways we can get caught up too much in a technical fix aimed at making them independent and autonomous without reconnecting them through some sort of social support systems.
Mm-hmm.
And often the sort of people engaging with the technology, whether they be practitioners or the technologists themselves, can actually provide some of that social support, just in terms of regular contact with the people who are using the technologies, and establishing a relationship, right? Right.
Yeah, and in appropriate ways according to sort of gendered, making sure that there are considerations around gender and ethnicity, et cetera, and immigration status, et cetera.
Cultural sensitivity.
Yeah, appropriateness of, the interface, et cetera. Sorry, is that sufficient, or did you want us to expand?
Oh, no, that's perfect. Thank you. So there's kind of a related question, and I'm going to give the age-well answer, and then you can feel free to add to it. So Olive is asking, do you have examples of working with older adults and developing technology? So that is kind of the bread and butter of AgeWell as a Canada-wide network. We have an entire area of research that looks specifically at the needs of older adults and caregivers when it comes to technology. And all of that research is done closely with the participation of older adults and caregivers. And many of our technologies, and I would say most of our technologies, are developed in participation with end users, so that's older adults and caregivers. Just to give you some examples, Braze Mobility is one of our startups, providing an add-on system to a wheelchair that can turn any wheelchair into a smart wheelchair. So there was a lot of end user involvement in developing that particular technology, testing it out in people's homes and environments, and getting lots of feedback. Another one that still continues to be tested is the Steady Glove, which is a lightweight wearable glove that helps reduce tremors. So a lot of these, the age-well kind of way of doing things is to involve older adults and caregivers in all of our work. In some way, we are working towards having an older adult advisory committee at the network level as well to ensure that we're doing that well. And we also conduct relevancy reviews. So anytime we put out a call for funds and we get applications in, they are reviewed by an older adult or a caregiver to ensure that they would be relevant and useful for that population in their day-to-day lives. So that's kind of the age-well answer. I don't know if Karen and Simon, if you want to add anything to that.
I think, you, Dorina, and at the Network Management Office know the most about the projects, the projects that are being commercialized. But certainly, I was fortunate enough to be at the meeting last year, and I saw this, the technology in action, and that was wonderful. So the Braze Mobility was there, of course, and the glove to reduce tremors, et cetera. And I think those are fascinating and wonderful, I think, initiatives, technological initiatives. And I think that having spoken to the designers of those technologies, and several of their research members attended, or the team members attended our knowledge mobilization workshop, I feel very confident that what Simon and I have talked about today about this sort of overlaying understanding the importance of the health equity lens here, that these groups will take this up.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also with AgeWell, I think what's happening in some ways is that at the same time that each individual project is trying to figure out how to engage older adult end users in their processes, there's also specific AgeWell projects that are focused on developing new methods and processes and programs for engagement of end users. So I think there's kind of a dual set of processes going on. On one hand, some people are working on innovation around engagement processes, and then there's other projects. The vast majority of projects are just trying to develop their products by engaging older adults. So I think that there's a lot of work to do. I wouldn't say just in AgeWell, but everywhere. Yeah. But certainly, I think one of the things that we would argue for is to sort of, as Karen said, integrate this equity perspective there as well, because often it's so hard to get people engaged in the first place that you will sort of be somewhat satisfied by getting almost anyone who will be willing to participate. And while that's laudable, we really do think that it's important to be cognizant of the fact that people might be excluded, not through active exclusion, but simply passive exclusion.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. So I think that's a great spot to end. I think there is one more slide, if you could just advance.
Yes.
Yes. So this is our next webinar. It's being presented by Laura Campbell and Watts, and it is on consent and capacity, part 1 of 2. So the link is there in the chat box, and we are going to put this on our website with a fuller description in the coming days. But just so you have a heads up, it'll be on March 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern. So thank you everyone for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, Karen and Simon, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Dorina, for moderating.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Bye, everyone.